Trees of Life, Trees of Death, 2007. I'm very pleased to be delivering this tribute in honor of the Department of Forestry's centennial. I'll divide my talk into three parts, and I'll even tell you what they are, just so you know what's coming. Part 1 is about my own background in relation to trees and forests. Part 2 is about mythological and symbolic significance of trees and forests. Part 3 is about our present situation. In a world with dwindling forests, how much trouble are we in, really, and what should we do? I have a long association with the Department of Forestry and indeed with forests, which wasn't really of my own choosing. For instance, this March I happened to be in Okinawa. As we were driving north towards the forest of Yanbaru, home of the very rare Okinawa rail, which we failed to spot, I saw a long stretch of conifers that looked to be in trouble, dying or dead. You have an infestation, I said to our Japanese friend. Is it an insect? Yes, it was an infestation, and yes, it was an insect. A beetle, in fact. As J.B.S. Haldane so famously remarked, God seems to have an inordinate fondness for beetles, having created so many of them, and as he did not add, many of them eat trees. But our friend was astonished that I would have noticed this infestation. How did you know? He asked. Well, if there's one thing I can usually spot, it's an infestation. My father, Dr. Carl Atwood, was a research entomologist in the 1930s, in the early 1940s, with what was then called the Department of Lands and Forest. We'd be driving along the roads during our numerous trips in the north, and suddenly we would pull over to the side. An infestation, we would cry. Out would come the tarpaulin and an axe. The tarpaulin would be spread out under the infested tree. My father would hit the trunk with the butt of an axe, and the things, usually caterpillars, would cascade down from the branches. Then would help collect them, and then we would resume our journey until the next tempting infestation would cause us to screech to a halt. Our families stopped for ice cream cones. Ours stopped for infestations. My father's specialties at that time was spruce budworm and sawfly. With a glance at forest tent caterpillars, he was in the habit of gathering the tent caterpillars, webbing nests on their branches, as another person might pick roses, and putting the stems of these caterpillars' bouquets into the jars of water. But then he might forget to add fresh leaves, at which point the caterpillars would sally forth in search of fodder, making their way up the walls and across the ceilings, then plummeting into the soup. This was exciting for us kids, especially if company was present. My father went up to what was then a remote area of northern Quebec way back in 1937. The nearest town was Timiskaming, which already had a sawmill, though this operation had not become Tembec. There was no road. Access was by a small gauge railroad. On the shores of a large lake, he set up a little insect lab, built out logs by himself and helpers. Due to his own background, he knew of the backwoods of Nova Scotia, where his father ran a tiny sawmill. He was an expert with the axe. This was not an untouched wilderness. Logging went on there in the old way. The loggers, their horses, worked in the winters, chopping down selected trees and dragging them into the ice. When the ice melted in the spring, the logs were collected into the bloom and towed by tugboat into a river entrance, then shot downstream into the sawmill on the Ottawa River. These loggers didn't practice clear cutting. It wouldn't have been worth their effort to cut down everything. I'm old enough to have seen this form of logging in operation as a child. We would sometimes come across logs that had escaped, which could be made into very good rafts. I first went into this remote Quebec location in the spring of 1940, 5 months or so after I was born. My mode of transport was by pack sack. From then on, I spent a lot of time in forests. Although we lived in cities during the winters, insects being dormant in those months, we were up in the woods from April on before the ice went out, and staying sometimes as late as November, by which time there would already be a lot of snow. My father ran the cubic lab until 1944, at which point he went over to Sault Ste. Marie to set up the insect lab there. After that, in 1946, he began to teach forestry at the University of Toronto. I spent some of my youthful hours during the winters of late 1940s in the old zoology building, admiring the bottled eyeballs and the deadly white African cockroaches that were features of the place in those days. It was no accident that my first novel, written at the age 7, was about an aunt. I can't say this work is very gripping. Not much conflict can go out of the larval and pupal stages, but it is a happy ending, involving the capture, the biting, the finishing off, and the dragging of a communal ant nest of an especially delicious bug. I went I could get the novels of my later period to end so optimistically. My father was an early environmentalist, a very early one. For instance, he had his doubts about the wisdom of widespread spraying for infestation at a time when to have such doubts was to label yourself a lunatic. But as with many things, time has proven him right. A week ago, I received a letter from Ori Lukes, who was a graduate student of my father's in the early 1950s. He enclosed a reprint of his master thesis work, a study of shoreline reservations of pine left in the Cutico boundary waters at the time of 1942 to 43 logging. 49 years after his first study in 2002, Ori Lukes went back to Cutico Superior to see if the project had done. The 200-foot shoreline reservation strip, as it turns out, had been instrumental in creating a new pine forest 60 to 70 feet tall. In his journal of the trip, he comments on intergenerational influences from my father to him and now to his students. By that time, my father had been dead for almost 10 years. In many areas of life, it's not always possible to see how the choices we make will play out over time. This is particularly true of forestry and of forestry in Canada because most trees in the deciduous, mixed, and coniferous zones of this country grow very slowly in relation to us. Here I'll quote the words of someone who ought to know, namely Treebird the ant, from the Lord of the Rings, a character who is neither a tree-like hominid or a hominid-like tree. He is speaking about Old Entish, the language of the talking tree folk. It is a lovely language, he says, but it takes very long time to say anything in it, because we do not say anything in it unless it is worth taking a long time to say and to listen to. On the mythological level, you might say that forestry is a study of old Entish. It is a study of trees, but also of what trees tell us by how and where they grow, and of what changes they may bring about in the rest of the world by growing how and where they do. I can see and hear and smell and feel a great deal from this "ala la rumba kamana de lil broom," says Treebird, using an old Entish word. Excuse me, this is a part of my name, for it I do not know what the word is in the outside languages. You know, the thing we are on, where I stand and look out on fine mornings and think about the sun and the grass beyond the wood and the horses and the clouds and the unfolding of the world. The word for all of this is outside the languages is probably the environment or some such, but I prefer the unfolding of the world. As you have probably guessed, we are now in the part 2 of my talk. The part about mythology and symbolism, having arrived there by a labyrinthine ways, being lost in the forest, being the original labyrinthine experience, as anyone would know who has ever found him or herself walking around in circles in the woods. Just remember, Water always flows downhill. One thing I learned as a child was how to mark a trail. You should do it on both sides of the tree trunk, so that when you look back at a point, you will always know where you've just been. The relationship of Homo sapiens to trees and forests is a very old one, and one that has always involved mixed emotions. One scientific origin story has our ancestors coming down from the trees, and some of our distant relatives still make nightly nests in them, up in the branches, where they are safer from nocturnal predators that they might be on the ground. Why do so many people have a so called irrational fear of snakes, cats, and spiders? One theory is that those animals were the only ones that might be able to get at you if you were a primate nesting in a tree. A recent theory supposes that we left the forests because they were inhabited by a giant cat, Dinofelis, or false saber-tooth, a genus about the size of a large leopard that appears to have lurked in dense forests and specialized in eating or Australopithecine relatives. Another version of the original story has the forest dwindling due to climate change to be replaced by a more open savanna, with hominids thus forced to adapt to a very different environment. Trees would still be important for shade, and after fire was domesticated for fuel, but our ancestors may have developed an aversion to being completely surrounded by them because they provide such good cover for predators. The countryside, with its tiled fields and meadows and copses, is a far cry from the deep forests. Few people in the recent times have chosen to live inside deep forests. The jungle dwelling pygmies are an exception. Indigenous North Americans settle by shores and use waterways for transport as much as they do. They had the networks of trails to the woods, but you went that way when there was no alternative. Indigenous New Zealanders similarly kept to the shorelines. Our feelings about the deep forest, as expressed in the stories, old and new, are dominated by uneasiness and fear. In the oldest written poem we knew about the Epic of Gilgamesh, once one of the big heroic battles in Gilgamesh and his friend Enkidu versus the forest dwelling monster called Humbaba. Humbaba is the guardian of the cedar forest. Gilgamesh takes his axe to his forest, and Humbaba, although infuriated, loses the resulting fight and is then ruthlessly murdered. What makes this murder even worse is that Gilgamesh and Enkidu commit it after they have been invited as guests to Humbaba's home. In most cultures, it is strictly against the code to murder your host. The plunder Gilgamesh brings back to the city of Uruk consists of cedar trees he has cut down, a valuable commodity for the city built on the treeless plain. The god Shamash is pleased with this result, but the god Enlil is furious and curses Gilgamesh. That conflict about tree cutting has been played out ever since. In ancient stories, to cut down a forest or a grove of trees is often to violate a taboo. Some groves are sacred, but sacred to which god? To cut or not to cut, either way, you're usually going to be in trouble with someone. Jehovah wants to cut groves down. Astoret, the moon goddess, wants to leave them standing. In Greek mythology, the moon goddess Artemis is also the goddess of forests and mistress of animals. To demolish the forest is to strike against the wild creatures in favor often of pastoralists who want grazing pastures or agriculturalists who tilt the fields. But anger the mistress of animals too much and you'll be sorry, for she is also she who sends plagues. Does that remind you of anything you might have heard about species jumping diseases such as Ebola, Marburg, and AIDS, and how they move to seek fresh hosts, such as us, as the old hosts disappear due to habitat destruction? The Greek story told us about Erixinthon, who, despite warnings, cut down a sacred grove with his axe, struck the first tree. Blood gushed out. It was the blood of Hamadryad, who lived in the tree. His crime was punished by Demeter, goddess of vegetable fertility and harvests, who inflicted famine upon him. There is indeed a complex relationship between trees and soil fertility. Denude the landscape of its trees, especially a hilly landscape, and the floods and soil erosion by wind and water will follow, with famine as a result. Resu- Something that the Greeks had already learned several thousand years ago. The columns of Greek temples were imitation trees. So were the branched ribs of Norman cathedrals. And most mythologies include a world tree or a tree of life which upholds all life on earth. In the Christian religion, the tree of life grows in the Garden of Eden. It's the one with the apples Adam didn't eat, having munched on the fruit of the tree of knowledge instead, which is why we're smart but not immortal, in case you were wondering. But for every positive symbol, there's a negative counterpart. There's a tree of death as well as a tree of life. Poetic versions of the wastelands usually have dead trees in them, or no trees at all, or the trees have been destroyed and replaced by stone or metal pillars. In the Christian religion, the tree of death is represented by the cross, a dead tree upon which death is inflicted. The tree hurting ends in the Lord of the Rings are the good side of things, and punish the tree cutting wizard Saruman. But in Tolkien's invented world, where there are wild trees and the bad trees as well as the good trees, the bad ones have bad hearts, and there are also entire forests that have gone bad. Their trees will grab hold of you or imprison you within themselves. Dorothy in The Wonderful Wizard of Oz encounters this bad kind of tree. There's a forest of fighting trees on the road to Oz and won't let her pass. And the problem is solved only by decisive Tin Woodsman who takes his axe to the brutes and clears a path. The powerful and destructive Whomping Willow in the Harry Potter series has a very respectable line of ancestors. Dante's Divine Comedy begins with a labyrinth metaphor. In the middle of the journey of her life, I came to my senses in a dark forest, for I had lost a straight path. Oh, how hard it is to tell what a dense, wild, and entangled wood this was, the thought of which renews my fear. We are led to infer that this forest represents error and sin, a departure from the true path. It's a place where you stray, where you get lost. In olden days, being lost in the forest usually meant death by starvation, exposure, or wild beast, as indeed it still does. If you go down to the woods today, you might not want to see the teddy bear's picnic, but you'd sure prefer not to be teddy bear's picnic, as you may well be if you overstay your visit. Shakespeare's forests are less fearsome than Dante's, but they aren't exactly light and cheerful. Sometimes they're places of enchantment and illusion, inhabited by creatures not entirely human, like the forest in A Midsummer Night's Dream, and sometimes they are places of enhanced freedom. A forest of Arden, as you like it, shelters exiles in flight from a tyrannical king, just as Sherwood Forest shelters Robin Hood. To that extent, the forest represents communion with nature and the freedom from injustices of civilization, as it does much later in Fenimore Cooper's The Leather-Stocking Tales. But outlaws can just as easily be robbers and murderers, and many of these met with literature, and especially in folk tales. For the forest is a realm of predators, we can't seem entirely to forget that. It's when Red Riding Hood goes off to the path of the dark forest that she encounters the wolf. The quintessential dark forest experience is graphically described in that classic children's tale, Kenneth Graham's The Wind in the Willows. The wild wood is a dangerous place, and the little Moor ought to have heeded the warnings he was given about it. Everything was very still now. The dusk advanced on him steadily, rapidly, gathering behind and before, and the light seemed to be draining away like flood water. Eventually, as a mole lay there, panting and trembling and listening to the whistlings and patternings outside, he knew at last, in all its fullness, that dread thing which other little dwellers in field and hedgerow had encountered here, and known as the darkest moment, that thing which the rat had vainly tried to shield him from, the terror of wild wood. Those who live in the open, on plains, or far north above the tree line are grazers rather than listeners, because anything that is going to get you will be seen before it's heard. But those who dwell in the forests are listeners, because anything that's going to get you will be heard before it's seen. That's why the white whistlings and the patternings are so frightening to Mole. The fact is that no matter how many ecological reports we read about the importance of maintaining forests, we are secretly afraid of them, and we are also in awe of them. A fact of our nature that keeps throwing up fictional versions like The Woods Where All Names Are Lost, and Alice Through the Looking Glass, and the elf ruled Golden Forest of Lothlorien, and The Lord of the Rings, where you may become entangled in the woods where Merlin lies in an enchanted sleep in Arthurian lore. Stay in such forests too long and you'll forget who you are. The forest may be alluring, but you enter it at your peril. E.O. Wilson, in his disconcerting book about the future of life, sets our relationship in the forests in an interesting way. What kind of location do human beings prefer? He suggests we look at what rich people do. Those who can afford anything choose to build on the height of the land, overlooking an open landscape in which there's a river or a lake, with some trees at a distance but not too close and thick. This would be, in fact, an ideal spot for hunter gatherers, water to drink, and attract game. Forest to shelter animals but not too close, a good view all around. This may account for the huge amount of forest burning done by the Australian Aboriginals before contact. They like a clear understory and a wide view. The same kind of view, or even a picture on the wall, has been found to reduce by a factor of 6 the time takes people to heal in the recovery rooms of the hospitals. It seems we find this prospect soothing. Do we therefore have an innate bias in favor of cutting down trees? Wilson thinks we might have. If we give into it completely, it will be worse for us, because if we cut down all the trees in the world, we're all doomed. An old proverb from India says, forests precede civilizations, deserts follow. This formula has played itself out many times over in the history already. The story of Easter Island, where the destruction of all the trees led to soil erosion and famine and cannibalism, is only one of many. We've been told many times about the importance of Amazon forests, lungs of the planet, they've been called, to the maintenance of Earth's climate, yet those forests continue to be felled. The forests of Borneo are going fast. The axe of Gilgamesh is busily at work, and some of the gods are pleased, the gods of money, for instance, those who promote the idea of something for nothing, and the delusion that you can take from nature endlessly without giving back. But the mistress of animals is getting very annoyed with us, and one of her maxims may well be, there is no free lunch. Canada contains the largest boreal forest in the world. It has a long association with trees and tree cutting. The early settlers cut down everything they could for the fear of forest fires, and to clear pasture, and to make charcoal, and to export to Europe. We're still cutting away, often quite rapidly and indiscriminately. We're still indulging ourselves in the fantasies of endlessness. We're still telling ourselves that nothing produced by nature is ours by right and also free. Why are we still saying that clear cutting is a natural thing to do? Because forest fires are natural too, and they burn large areas, so isn't it the same thing? Why are we turning priceless old growth forest into toilet paper? Part of this is just laziness and greed, but part of it comes from our ancient ambivalence toward forests, our fear of them. How long do we go this way before we destroy our enormous natural carbon sink, reduce the fragile north with its thin soil covers to a rocky wasteland, and in the process wipe out large number of species before we scorch ourselves to death? How soon before we start paying people not to cut down trees, and just as farmers have been paid for not planting potatoes? Because I'm a cheerful person, I like to introduce a ray of hope. There are many counter movements already set in the motion. Worldwide fire has long known the importance of habitat to species protection and has brought up large tracts of forests all over the world. Nature Conservancy is a very active in Canada and in the United States and has been successful in acquiring small but very significant pieces. The old form of logging is coming back, selective logging with minimal damage to the forest. It may interest you to know, for instance, that a group of Buddhists is carrying on single tree logging with horses in Nova Scotia right now. One of the reasons people are afraid of forests is that, especially if they've grown up in the cities, they aren't familiar with them. The value of early education is being increasingly recognized, as witnessed the growth of outdoor classrooms in Britain, where it's been found that children actually learn better when they're not in the closed classroom environment. Young children have a natural interest in nature if they aren't discouraged by adults. How many outdoor classrooms do we have in Canada? None at the moment, though we do have summer camps. The Japanese have an expression, forest bathing, to immerse yourself in the forest for purposes of cleansing and relaxation. For a person who feels comfortable in the forest and not afraid of it, like the mole, this does actually work. C.W. Nicole, the only Japanese ex Canadian Welsh karate 7-degree black belt in the world and an ardent environmentalist, has a small forest trust in Japan called the Afan Woodland Trust. This is a managed forest that produces some woods for the local traditional crafts and various precious medicinal fungi and what the Japanese called mountain vegetables. The vision is similar to managed rainforest and shade coffee plantations, serving human needs in concert with restoration and maintenance. At the Evan Woodland Trust, they've also been doing several kinds of studies concerning people forest interactions. One measured the ability of a stay in a forest to normalize blood pressure. Low blood pressure increases, high blood pressure decreases. Another has involved work with abused and damaged children, which has proven amazing successful. The forest can contribute to a healing of the psyche as well as to healing of the body. The name Woodland Trust is suggestive. That's what we need. Woodland trust. We need to trust the woodland instead of feeling alienated from it and afraid of it. If we can do that, we may cease our indiscriminate destruction and recognize our forests for what they are: the ancient homelands, purifiers of air, shelters of species, protectors from sun, coolers of climate, healers of hearts, soothers of soul, unfolders of the world. I'll end by quoting again from the tree bird the end. A few words we might well take as a motto. There are wastes of stump and bramble where once there were singing groves. He says, I have been idle. I have let things slip. It must stop.